Hello and welcome to today's live webinar brought to you by the Life Sciences team at Reed Tech and our friends at CISEMA. Reed Tech periodically hosts industry guests to share insights and field audience questions on topics related to Global Health Authority, related regulations and requirements. We're thrilled to host panelists from CISEMA, a regulatory consultancy and CRO for China. We're joined by Hamish King, CEO, and Victoria Caldy, Business Development and Marketing Director. Our moderator is Gary Sainer, Senior Manager of Information Solutions at Reed Tech. Today's topic is about compliance for China Class 2 medical device UDI, with the deadline due just 2 months away in June of 2024. We are recording. Everyone is muted for the presentation. We do encourage questions. This is an Ask the Expert series, so please feel free to pop any questions that you have in the questions box. We will take a look at those at the end. If you're having problems with the audio, try calling the phone number that's listed in your invite. And as always, the slides and the video link will be sent to all registrants shortly after the live presentation. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Hamish King to tell us a little bit about CISEMA.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for Reed Tech for having us to present and to co-present with them again this year about China UDI, a bit more of a niche topic, but in particular the Reed Tech team are talking about it every day. And they are the real go-to experts for this global topic. We are a regulatory consultancy focused on China and Hong Kong, including the Hong Kong market, which is where I'm presenting from today. We were founded by a German Siemens engineer sent out to China 30 years ago. We have around 100 staff worldwide, but all wholly focused on supporting companies enter the market of China. And that's across product scope of medical device and IVD, pharmaceutical products, cosmetics, health foods, and so on. I am Hamish King. I'm the CEO at CISEMA. I'm an Australian national. I've been in Hong Kong for 8 years. As mentioned, we have nearly 100 staff. Most of those are Chinese in China, but we want to speak the language of the customer, whether that's English or of course German, Japanese, Korean, French, Spanish. And Victoria, who's joining me today, is a nice example here. She's fluent in French and Spanish and even a little German. Victoria, over to you to introduce yourself briefly.
Thanks, Hamish. Yeah, so I'm Victoria Caldy. I've been with CISEMA just over a couple of years now, helping clients in various markets get their products to market in China and in Hong Kong. So I'm actually joining you today from Malaga in Spain. I think we can now move on to the next slide.
Oh, a little bit about Reed Tech. By the way, I'm Angela Alexandro. I lead the marketing operations here at Reed Tech. We've been out there for over 20 years with SPL UDI since the origin with the US FDA in 2014. We've submitted over 750,000 SPLs to FDA Good ID and over 20,000 records to UDI actually. We are a major industry provider of SPL records and UDI solutions, and about 33% of all the electronic Good ID records with FDA are submitted by Reed Tech. We do support US, EU, China, Korea, and we do have a roadmap for other international UDI databases, including Australia UDI that's coming up. We have served over 450 medical device customers since our inception, and that's from the very small to the very largest. And we do have a solution that provides for flexible role assignments for in-country representatives and corporate users. We're also, as you can see, very active with industry groups, including HL7, GS1, RAPS, and MedTech Europe. We're also the official UDI provider for Vision Council and Dental Trade Alliance here in the US. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Gary Sainer, who's our moderator, and is going to take us through the agenda.
Well, welcome everyone, and I want to give a special welcome to CISEMA for those people that are able to join us today and those in the audience. As we work our way through some topics, we're going to focus obviously on some of the upcoming regulations, but before we actually get to those details, I'd like to set the groundwork, a little bit of regulatory framework, if you will, as to the particular regulations that are in play when a company imports a product into China, and some of those regulations that are in play when you're marketing products in China. After that, we'll get into those details of the upcoming deadline. Just literally a few weeks away, June 1st, 2024, so we have some details on that. And then if you do need to meet those UDI requirements, we'll go into a lot more details about identifying your product and UDI reporting into the Chinese database. And for those in the audience that are outside China and importing into China, there's a number of rules and other process procedures that you need to comply with, and we'll touch on those particular topics as well. And then we'll kind of wrap up with those next steps. What are you looking to do at this point in time, where, depending on where you are in your roadmap with implementing China UDI, and then we'll reserve some time at the end for Q&A. So it's a pretty full agenda. Some slides that I have, I'll leave for homework and I'll just kind of skip over. But if you have questions, you're certainly able to get back to us, contact us, and we'll go into more detail. So with that, let's move over to the framework. And Hamish, I'm going to look to you to cover these next couple slides here about the actual regulations and the particular hierarchy in the Chinese Regulatory Health Authority.
Thank you, Gary. Yes, we won't spend too much time on the overview. We'll just make sure we're all on the same page, because understanding there may be different levels of attendees here today. But a reminder that for the Chinese regulatory framework, the top level is the State Council. China is, of course, a very centralized country. It is those combined executive branch, as well as the parliament, so to speak, is all in one. It passes the law. The key regulatory authority relating to UDI and medical device more broadly is the NMPA. After restructure a few years ago, it sits underneath the SAMR, State Administration for Market Regulation. The SAMR is still relevant, however, because the SAMR is generally more responsible for continuing compliance, post-market work, surveillance, and that is increasing in importance in China as elsewhere in the world. So companies must always ensure that they maintain compliance, and that is why we're talking today about existing products that require updates to their regulatory approvals in China, specifically relating to UDI, but there are also many other changes and continuing changes over time that require continuing updates. NMPA has its divisions and departments, most relevantly the CMDE, Center for Medical Device Evaluation, and it is the department most responsible for product approvals, as well as ongoing review. Next slide, please, Gary.
Yeah, so here we're just going to quickly cover the registration pathway for, in case people joining today haven't actually entered the Chinese market yet. So at the moment I've split the slide into two sections. One is mainland China and the other one is specific parts of China. So in general, you would normally go through a standard application with the NMPA to register your medical device for use in China. And this typically requires a home country approval. So if you manufacture within Europe, you would need the CE mark. If you manufacture within the US, you would need the FDA mark, etc., etc. You would also require a clinical evaluation report or potentially a clinical trial. And there is a list of products that are actually exempt from clinical trial or for certain types of clinical evaluation, and we can guide you on those. There are also very specialist priority review and processes which have been used, for example, during the COVID pandemic. which is also of interest, which you may or may not be aware of at the moment, is that the NMPA launched a green route, so the innovative medical device application route, a few years ago. And this does not actually require any prior approval anywhere. So you can go straight to market with your first approval in China. However, there is one provision that you will need a China patent. And obviously you'll need to meet certain requirements, such as the technology being particularly innovative, to actually get this special status. Then there are other ways of getting into China, which focus on specific parts of China. So for example, you could enter the Hong Kong market, which in itself is its own market separately in terms of administration and registrations from China. But you can use your listing within Hong Kong to actually access what's known as the Greater Bay Area. Now this area is probably roughly the size of Germany in terms of population, and while registration in Hong Kong is voluntary, to be able to access the Greater Bay Area, you do have to list within Hong Kong to be able to get into the GBA. It will also require a hospital to be backing your product, and actually they will obtain the approval from the Guangdong NPA to actually sell and import, well, to use that product and import that product into the GBA. But it's a great opportunity to be able to collect real-world data, if you don't have any real-world data, on Chinese ethnic populations. And it's a very similar case with Hainan, and Hainan is a very specific island just off the south of China, and it's generally known as sort of the Hawaii for China. And there is an international medical tourist zone there, where again, you will actually require home country approval. And again, a hospital sponsor, and again, it gives you that opportunity to collect real world data. So that's just to give you an idea of the overview of the different pathways that you can enter China with your medical device. And then we'll move on to the next slide now, please, Gary.
Thanks, Gary. And just a reminder about the timeline for entry. I won't go into much detail here, except to say that Chinese products, products that are registering for China require type testing or specific performance testing, which must generally be done in China. That is a key gating item that you must do whether or not your product has done such testing elsewhere in the world. So that is a key issue to be aware of, and that takes quite some practical difficulties in our experience, and is very worthwhile to have some external advice. Also, there's a specific China clinical evaluation report, which is not simply a translation of your marketing authorization from US or EU. Otherwise, the framework is generally similar or consistent to other jurisdictions and takes around 18 months for a Class 2 product, which is more relevant for today's session, or 21 months for a Class 3. Class 1 is more like 4 months filing.
Great, so thanks, Hamish. I think we can move on to the next slide and have a look specifically at the regulations that impact UDIs. So once you've entered the market, or you're planning on entering the market, there are certain regulations that you need to take into account that impact the UDI, the label, and the IFU. So here we can see that the main overarching regulation that affects medical devices and IVDs in China is known as the Order 739, or otherwise known as the Regulation for the Supervision and Administration of Medical Devices. And this came into effect on the 1st of June 2021. And in particular, it's Article 38 that has called for the implementation in a phased manner of the UDI. And this is, the aim is to assist with device data traceability and ongoing post-market surveillance, as we see in other countries. And today we are now in the third phase or batch of implementation, and there are specific rules and announcements affecting UDIs. So the first rule, first of all, the rules for the UDI system was announced in 2019 and came into effect in October of that year. And they stipulate that the system is composed of 3 parts, which we'll look at a bit later with Gary. So you have the UDI code, the UDI carrier or label, and the UDI database. And the rules state that it is the registrant or filer who is responsible for creating and maintaining the UDI and putting it on the label or carrier and uploading it to the database. And the rules also cover, for example, UDI issuing agencies who must be based in China. And again, Gary is going to cover that a little bit later. And they have to submit a report each year on the UDI that have been issued in the previous calendar year. And that this UDI must be uploaded to the UDI database before being put on sale in the market. Then we also have provisions for instructions and labels. Now these date back to July 2014, so that's almost 10 years ago now. And of course, they don't specifically mention UDI because this is a new concept since they were issued. However, the UDI is expected to figure on the device label. And again, we're going to take a look at that. Then finally, we've got the provisions for medical device adverse event monitoring. Now, these came into effect in January 2019. And as part of any adverse event or potential recall that you may undertake or that the NMPA may instruct you to undertake, then the UDI database will be consulted by the NMPA. And there are also provisions for ordering revisions of labels and instructions for use if it's found that the device is linked to an adverse event. Next, we have the 3 announcements that are specifically related to the implementation of the UDI system in 3 phases to date, and there will be further batches. So the first batch came into effect on the 1st of January 2021, so 3 years ago now. And that covered Class 3 products. The second batch came into effect on the 1st of June last year, in 2022, so just 2 years ago. And that extended it out to cover all Class 3 products. Then the third batch was announced and it comes into effect on the 1st of June this year, so in just, 6 weeks' time. Then finally, we also have standards which affect the UDI. Now, first of all, there are standards which are specific to the medical device industry, and these are designated with the letters YY. So here you can see various standards, such as the 1680 from 2018. Now this covers things such as the basic requirements for a UDI, as to which packaging level there should be an ID, and as well how to identify production. The standard 1681 from 2019 lists out the terminology that must be used. The standard from number 1752 from 2020 lists the data sets one by one of what must be submitted to the UDI database, and Gary will cover this later. And then finally, we've got standard 1753, which gives guidelines on filing in the UDI database using the data sets that are identified in the previous standard 1752. And it also covers methods on how to fill in the database, as well as giving some examples. Now, those are the standards that are very much specific to the medical device industry, designated, as I said, by YY. Then we also have national standards. Now, national standards are designated by the letters GB. So these apply not only to medical devices, but also apply to toys or food, or if you're also in the pharmaceutical industry. In fact, any product that is sold in China that has a requirement for having a barcode or a QR code. So here you can see that there are 2 standards that refer specifically on creating QR codes and barcode terminology. So we're going to just take a little look before we move on to the UDI in general. We're going to take a look now at some other upcoming regulatory changes that you also need to be aware of. If we can move to the next slide, Gary. Yeah, so obviously here we've listed out some regulatory updates and news that you need to be aware of what's happening in the industry in China. Obviously, as we know, and that's why we're here today, is the UDI batch 3 for 141 Class 2 medical devices that comes into place on the 1st of June. But every year, the NMPA will update medical device classification catalogues and the clinical exemption catalogues. So you need to be aware that, for example, at the moment, you may indeed have a Class 1 product that may, at some point during the year, actually be classed as a Class 2. So you need to be constantly kept aware of what is happening and to see whether then this UDI requirement actually applies to your device. There are also many standards that are updated on a regular basis in China. Notably, one that is a hot topic at the moment is the GB National Standard 9706, and this covers medical equipment. And there are various implementation dates that are in process here, so you need to be aware of that if you've got medical electrical equipment. Quality management standards are also updated, and for example, specific types of devices can be brought within the medical device area, such as radio frequency beauty devices. Now, these were previously considered under cosmetics and are now in the main Class 3 medical devices. Other guidelines that are also being issued recently are information on how to undertake real-world evidence research and how you can design your research plans, how to write, for example, instructions for use for IVDs, and also how about going about your usability engineering and how to provide those reports to the NMPA. And other important news that you need to be aware of is that the NMPA is restarting overseas factory inspections. So in the first quarter of this year, there have been at least 26 companies overseas who have received notifications that the NMPA will be going to inspect them. So that is for their GMP to make sure that everything is compliant. As I mentioned earlier, one of the pathways into China is through the Greater Bay Area, and the demand for medical products there is surging, was surging in 2023, and we see that continuing in 2024. Something also to be aware of is that you can't actually submit a product change notification and a renewal at the same time. So previously this was allowed, but it is no longer allowed. So if you know that you have a renewal coming up, but you need to also submit a product change, you need to do that beforehand. And there's also implications for your UDI at the same time. And then finally, something that you may or may not be aware of is that the NMPA brought into place a medical device master file to be able to help certain suppliers to medical device manufacturers protect their IP by gaining independent authorization for their component or their materials or their processes that are supplied to the final company submitting the registration. So that's something to be aware of fairly important updates and news happening in the market. So thanks, Gary, and I think we'll move on to the next section now.
All right, well, very good. That was excellent review of the regulatory pathways, the various regions, and late-breaking news. This is a full-time job, keeping track of regulations, and certainly we see it in other health authorities, and it's no different with China. A lot of changes going on. If you're marketing products in there, you really need to have your ear to the regulations. Thank you, Hamish and Victoria, for providing that. We're going to move a little bit now and get focused in on the particular medical devices that are up for the UDI deadline. So there is a compliance date of June 1st of this year, and I'm going to ask that we go into that. I think, Victoria, you're up to give us some details on the actual timing of this particular activity.
Yes, thanks, Gary. So here you can see how the implementation is phased over time, and we're expecting future batches as well through 2025 and beyond. As I have already mentioned, so we'll just briefly skip through this. So in 2021, we had certain Class 3. In fact, there were 69 devices of Class 3 that required a UDI to be implemented by the 1st of January 2021. Then on the 1st of June 2022, it was the remaining Class 3, including IVD reagents. And then what is coming into play on the 1st of June in just 6 weeks' time is batch 3. And this has certain Class 2 products, and these are essentially the single-use products with large clinical demand, products in the scope of medical insurance centralized procurement, medical cosmetology related products, and other class 2 medical devices. And in total, there are a number of 141 medical devices that are affected by this particular date of the 1st of June. So when we look on the next slide, we'll get an idea of what this means. What do you need to do? So for these 141 medical devices, there are two aspects that you need to take into account. One is the actual registration requirements for your product, and the next one is the UDI labeling requirements. So if we go to the registration requirements, so if your product, your medical device, is registered prior to June the 1st, 2024, then the UDI of the smallest unit has to be submitted when the product registration is either renewed or the registration is changed, which is why it's important of what I linked back to before. You cannot renew and change your product at the same time. So it's when either or happens. Now, if your registration application is due to be received on or after the June 1st of this year, then the UDI of the smallest unit has to be submitted as part of that registration application. So if you are currently in the process and you're expecting a registration certificate after the 1st of June, your legal agent should be working with you to be part of that registration application as your UDI approval. Now, when it comes to actually labeling requirements, so this is before placing your product on the market with the manufacturing date of the 1st of June. So you must have obtained approval from the NMPI for the UDI. Now, it doesn't mean you can't just use any UDI that you deem fit. You must obtain approval from the NMPA for the UDI that you want to use. And then this UDI for the smallest sales unit and the highest level packaging must be uploaded to the UDI database. And Gary will talk about this shortly. And you must include any medical insurance classifications as codes as well in that UDI database. So which products are we actually talking about? So if we have a look on the next slide, I've given you an idea of the main categories of products. Gary, if we move on. So here we are. So the third batch product categories. So in total there's 15 categories, and it covers everything from active surgical instruments such as ultrasound, passive surgical instruments such as knives and forceps, instruments for neurological and cardiovascular surgery, orthopedic surgical instruments, medical imaging equipment such as X-ray machines, medical examination and monitoring equipment, respiration, anesthesia and first aid equipment such as intubation, physical therapy equipment such as red light therapy, blood transfusion, dialysis and cardiopulmonary bypass instruments, active implantation devices such as the neurotest stimulator, infusion, nursing and protective equipment, ophthalmic instruments, obstetrics and gynecology, assisted reproduction and contraceptives, and medical rehabilitation equipment such as hearing aids and clinical testing instruments such as blood sample collection devices. So as you can see, a huge amount of these products are actually active medical devices, which means they are using some kind of electricity. So that means you will be affected by the GB 9706 standard, which I mentioned earlier. So if you are affected by that, then you need to look at the implementations of that, submit any change notification, and at the same time, if you are submitting these change notifications, you would be submitting your UDI approval and request to the NMPA. So I think that's all on the types of products that are covered at the moment, Gary.
All right, very good, thank you. We'll move on to a poll question. So Angela, I think you have prepared a poll questions. We went over a whole list of products, a lot of class 2 products. You might have actually already submitted some class 3. So why don't we launch a poll question to see how the audience, their particular portfolio applies to the UDI regulations in China.
Yep, hopefully everyone can see on their screen. If you will click into the poll, we really appreciate you playing along. Do the China UDI requirements affect your company? And there are 5 choices there. Yes, we've already reported for class 3 in China. Not affected yet, but we have class 2 products to file. We have over 10 Class 2 devices for UDI filing. Next, we have over 100 Class 2 devices, or the last, not yet, we have only Class 1 devices in China. So I see folks are playing along with the poll. Thank you so much. And looks like we have just about everything in, so I'm going to close that. And then I'll share the results. So 33% have already reported for Class 3 in China, and evenly split between the other 4 categories. Interesting. Okay.
All right, thank you, Angela. That's interesting. Looks like a number have already submitted their Class 3s, only about a third in the audience, but it's like a lot of the others have some upcoming Class 2s, and we're glad to provide good information on how you go about doing that. So this next section has to do with a little bit more of the details of actually identifying your products with UDI and the reporting procedure. Hamish and Victoria did a great job of presenting the framework and the overall requirements, but now we're going to dive into some of the details. Some of these slides I'll work my way through rather quickly. Certainly, if you have already submitted UDI records to China, you're familiar with the process. Or if you've applied UDI to products for other health authorities, UDI is pretty familiar with your particular internal processes. Hopefully you have policies and so on to support that. But we'll step through these next couple slides regarding UDI. Real quick definition that UDI is that code that identifies your product, has 2 parts, a mandatory portion that's always there, the device identifier, and then a conditional portion called the production identifier that is created if you have a manufacturing date, expiration date, lot or batch number, or serial number on the label. And if you simply concatenate both the device identifier and the production identifier together, you get a very long string, and in some cases, certainly if you have all those production identifiers, it gets to be quite lengthy. If you have questions on this, you can get back to us, but I believe most of the audience are familiar with what UDI is and how to go about creating it. Now let's talk a little bit about the requirements. I have this quadrant with 4 different areas, and when you go from health authority to health authority, they're very much the same at a high level. They all address these 4 different areas: how you identify the product. So there's information that needs to go on the label. All of this looks very familiar if you've been identifying products for other health authorities. Nothing too unique here. There is a requirement in China to have direct marking on those devices that are multiple use, meaning different patients, and reprocessed. So this does match up rather well with the US kind of definition there. And then there is this requirement to submit data to the database. We'll talk a little bit more about that. There are 51 attributes. There does not include the basic UDI-DI. So if you have been keeping an eye on the European regulations, their database, UDIMED, requires a particular attribute called a basic UDI-DI, and that is not present with the Chinese data set. And then don't forget all these items about documentation. So I call this bottom right quadrant the forgotten quadrant. Actually, in the U.S., inspections finds a lot of companies with the issues here, and warnings that would be generated based on some findings here where a company had forgotten to put these documentations together. But anyway, there is this requirement to keep those records after discontinuation, and you have the requirement to renew registration, as Victoria had mentioned, every 5 years. Now, there are some additional unique guidelines that I just want to touch on real quickly. You may not have been including the day in your date format, and it is now required to have that particular format be year dash month dash day. And there is this requirement to include the manufacturer date. So in other health authorities, sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not there. It's kind of a an optional type of thing. But in China, it's a quite different approach. So the manufacturer date is very important. Downstream users need to use that date to make sure that it's within the 5-year validation registration period. So if you have a very old product manufactured, earlier than 5 years ago, that's going to be an issue. So the way to keep track of that, a way to have users verify that license, is to have the manufacturer date on the label. So make sure that's included in your label design. On the label itself, obviously you need to put that UDI code. If there's some space considerations, you want to make sure you prioritize the AIDC, so that's the automatic identification data capture. Typically that's a barcode. Make sure that manufacturing date and UDI layers on top of all the other mandatory requirements. So you kind of have to squeeze the UDI in if you're redesigning your class 2 labels. And then there is some maintenance. So if there's changes that would affect the identification traceability, then a new label has to be created, and more importantly, a new device identifier needs to be recorded and also reported and placed actually on the label. So what does this typically look like? I'll go over this very quickly. This is a single barcode representation with that device identifier followed by the production identifier. It may be much smaller if you don't have all those production IDs, but make sure that manufacturing date, this is code 11. I'm using GS1 as an example, but there are other issuing agencies in China. And then you have the option of doing the 2-dimensional barcode, highlight that. You have some layout options, either a single line or multiple lines for the actual text, something called the human readable interpretation. And then in China, we'll talk a little bit more about this. GS1 is an approved issuing agency, Ziat, and also Ali Health. And let's talk about that a little bit now. If you look around the world, the various health authorities, there's 3 that US and EU and almost all the health authorities have approved: the GS1, HIBIC, and ICCBA. But when you come to China, that precedent is not continued there. GS1 is included, so you're kind of safe using GS1. If you notice, there's checks all the way across each of the health authorities and regions. But China has also adopted Ziat and Ali Health as additional options for using that particular standard. When you lay out your label, you want to make sure this information is in there. So the actual UDI, the text version, and the AIDC. In this case, there's 2 versions. One is this 2-dimensional barcode, and there's also a linear barcode presented in 2 different portions there. One is satisfying the requirements. If you don't have downstream users that are able to read, a barcode, a single dimensional barcode, you can do the 2-dimensional barcode or vice versa. This is GS1 okayed, approved presentation to have 2 different barcodes, 2 different symbologies. So that's not a problem. Now, there's a couple things that come into play. We get a lot of questions about what in the world is this lowest sales unit. So there is a a hierarchy, and we use this as an example for our discussion. The base product, whatever your base product is, in this particular case, it might be a catheter. But that catheter can be packaged in various additional configurations. So it might go into 4 of them might go into a bag, and then 5 of those bags into a box. The other option is you might take catheters and put them in cases, put 6 of those in a particular case, and then put 8 cases in a carton. So the lowest sales unit, let's say at a local pharmacy or a hospital in this case that would buy the catheter, they might receive the box package, but yet they might break it down in their particular storage and inventory, and they might have the lowest sales unit in that case to be the base product, an individual catheter. And so there's a higher level packaging that is associated with that. In that case, from the base product all the way up through the high level packaging, according to GS1, each one of those needs a different UDI, and that would comply with the NMPA guidelines as well. Let's talk a little bit about the databases where this information is collected. When you coming from the U.S. As a precedent, and also European Union, UDI, in some cases they're separate database. UDI is kind of a conglomeration of many different databases. But in China, NMPA has 4 relevant databases for our discussion here. There's a product registration database, and you've been using that for years if you've been marketing products into China. There's another database that is set up and collects data for the records regarding UDI. And that has all the product detailed information. This is where the actual data is sent. But there's links between the registration database and the product UDI database. When you go about loading data into the product UDI database, you do have a couple options. One is you can go to their web interface, the user interface, and make a manual entry. You can do a manual file upload, or you can submit the data electronically, uses an API. That's actually how Reed Tech makes all their submissions. We use an electronic submission. We have an API set up to submit, whether it be 1 record or whether it be 10,000 records or 100,000 records. We would make use of the API connection. Noteworthy is that there is a requirement to have a local entity in China, referred to as the NMPA legal agent. So if you're importing products into China, this is not a new requirement, but it certainly comes into play when you report data to the UDI. So that qualified NMPA legal agent will need to set up that account and be involved in the reporting of the data into the database. We're not going to go through all these particular data attributes, but noteworthy is that many of them, 37 of the 51 total, are similar to the US FDA data set. So you can reuse a lot of the particular data values if you're marketing in both areas. And there's a couple that are very important. This Unified Social Credit Code, that is widely used in China. Make sure you have that. There's some other classification codes as well, the medical insurance code, that are part of this particular data set. I want to talk a little bit about the particular approach that you have. If you're a global manufacturer, you might be submitting in your own country, whether it be US or EU or South America, Australia, wherever, but there's local requirements. But then when you do submit products, or I should say deliver products and import products into China, then you have to abide by those particular regional health authority regulations. nothing new there, but it does come into play when you need to report UDI as well. So everything that you had been doing in the local domestic to comply with UDI is now repeated, and unfortunately it's not the same, but you still have to address all the requirements that NMPA has in place for importing products, including the UDI. Now, there's some things about the health authorities that I'd like to go through. If you compare China, the responsibility falls on the local rep, which is a little bit different if you've been importing products into the US. Here, the foreign manufacturer still has the reporting responsibility. If you've been importing into the EU under the MDR, IVDR, the foreign manufacturer has the reporting responsibility. But then it's different when you get to China. Local rep is involved, and the responsible party to comply with UDI. And by the way, this approach is similar with South Korea and Australia. So as you address those particular health authorities, the local rep is definitely involved. And I want to touch on how that local representation can be fulfilled. Many companies use an independent local rep. So CISEMA is independent local rep for China. They can act as your local agent. They have offices in China. So that is one of your options to make use of CISEMA. You're also able to use an importer, local importer or distributor. You, as a global company, might own an office inside China, or you might have a subsidiary or affiliate where you have partial ownership. And any one of those particular options, I actually think the independent local agent is widely used. So if you need to change a local agent, or you need to build a relationship with the local agent, make sure you talk to Hamish and Victoria. I'm sure they'll be able to take care of you. I'll leave this page for homework. It's a one-page summary of a lot of what we just talked about. I call it the note card. So this is a quick reference if you need to go back, be aware of the events that affect the UDI requirements, compliance timing in the bottom right, left-hand corner there with June 1, and then a little bit of a description, a lot of acronyms, so you can work your way through there. But there's, it's a one-page quick summary. Now, with that, time's moving on here, and I'd like to go over to NMPA inspections and customs. So if you're importing products into China, there's some information that you need to be aware of. Victoria, can you fill us in?
Absolutely, thanks, Gary. So in terms of UDI checks, what really does the NMPA do in terms of checking your compliance with the UDI rules and regulations and standards? Well, in terms of the UDI inspections, there isn't an actual specific inspection just for the UDI, but rather the UDI is checked as part of other checks during, for example, random inspections. So if there is, for an adverse event concerning your device, then of course the UDI is going to be verified as part of that. And the NMPA officer will check the status of your UDI in the UDI database. But in general, it's going to be the distributors or the hospitals who will regularly carry out checks about the UDI to make sure that they fulfill procurement requirements via tendering processes. So there isn't just the actual inspections themselves. There are also potentially something to bear in mind is what happens at customs. So the UDI itself isn't specifically checked at customs, but there are certain checks that are undertaken, and that is carried out regarding the label. So at customs, the customs officers will check that the products are correctly labeled and that the batch number and the expiration date are on the outer packaging as well as the product itself. They're also going to check that you've sent the correct documentation with that import, and that your NMPA legal agent, whether that be CISEMA or another consultancy, or your own company, or your distributor, has actually given power of attorney to the consignee to be able to use any filing or registration certificate to be able to import that product. Now, in addition to those sort of documentary checks, there will be additional checks and potentially random inspections undertaken on the labels and the quantity of goods as well at customs. So as I've mentioned, while there isn't a specific inspection or for UDI, there are obviously issues with not complying with those regulations and standards, and Hamish will take us through those penalties now.
Thank you. And yes, penalties have increased in the last years. Here they are listed on the slide. I mean, they're relatively straightforward, but there are fines of a bit of a 1,000 USD for specific fines. If there's continuing non-correction, then those fines can increase to over 10,000 USD. Other penalties or restrictions include suspension of your production or business license. The production license of the medical device can be revoked, and the business license as well. So there's escalating restrictions or penalties depending on the level and continuation of such non-compliance. There's also some specific other bans relating to income levels and relating to your legal representative. As Gary mentioned, the local rep plays a role here.
All right, very good. I think what we'll do now is take a look at what your next steps are. We've covered a lot of material, a lot of regulations. Let's get down to some real nitty-gritty next steps. What do we need to do? Victoria, let's start off with some information about if you're in a particular scenario.
Exactly.
You know, in the orange or the blue bucket.
Exactly. So here we are looking at what's happening at this point in time in April 2024. So obviously, if you're a class 3 product, that means you were affected in either the batch 1 or 2 for the UDI implementation. So that means if you've already got a class 3 product that is registered and on the market in China, then your UDI code must be on the product and the packaging. And that if you're actually in the middle of renewing your registration, or that you have a product change approval to make, then that UDI code has to be submitted as part of that registration renewal or change application. Now, if you're not yet registered and you want to register a medical device class 3 in China, then the UDI code must be submitted as part of the registration application. Now, looking at class 2, now obviously it's not all class 2 products, it's only those that we mentioned earlier on in the webinar. So there will be at some point a new batch 4, that maybe extend to the rest of the class 2, or maybe just certain parts of the class 2 again. So if you're in the batch 3 that are affected and your product is already in China, then you need to approach the NMPA for an approval for your UDI code. And that from the 1st of June, that UDI code must be on the product and the packaging that is manufactured. Then if you are not yet registered in China with your class 2, so here we are on the right-hand side, if you're registered before the 1st of June, then that UDI code again needs approval, and it must be on the product that's manufactured on or after the 1st of June. And if you are expecting your registration certificate to arrive on or after the 1st of June, then again, the UDI code must be submitted as part of that registration application. So you may be at the end of your registration application, so you need to make sure that you are getting your UDI code approved to be available after the 1st of June. And obviously at the moment, class 1s are not affected. However, it is optional to include them. But again, if you choose to do that, you need to get approval from the NMPA to do so. And obviously, it's important to keep an eye on the legislation as things can change quite rapidly in China. And now Hamish will move on to show us how we go about getting that that UDI in China, getting that approval.
Yes, and this is a timeline which supplements the earlier timeline that we showed as to the 18-month or 21-month, from experience timeline for a product registration for a Class 2 or Class 3 product. If you are going through that new registration, where does UDI fit in? After you have selected the NMPA legal agent, which was referred to earlier, you prepared the registration documents and done the type testing. As you're preparing your submission documents, that's when you should be, if you haven't already, selecting your UDI issuing agency, the blue kind of boxes along the bottom. We've got parallel workflows, generating your code and submitting that as part of your application. Once the registration certificate, coming back up the top again to the registration certificate, once that is issued after you've gone through the supplementary phase in NMPA approvals, then the UDI comes back into play, because that then needs submission and approval specifically as well, and only approved UDIs should be used. Then you take that UDI, upload it to the database, and can launch your product and start selling.
All right, very good. This next slide dives into a little bit more detail what you might be doing internally to perform those particular steps. I'll just hit the top 5 major categories here. Put your team together and basically prepare the process, and then prepare the data. So this collects data, and some of which is sourced from various departments and also from the agency themselves. Then make sure you have that data system in place, however you plan to submit that data. Fourth would be making those labeling changes to make sure you comply with all the added requirements for UDI, and then go into production. So, this is kind of another parallel stream, internal operations that needs to be coordinated with those regulatory requirements that we just mentioned above. So let's get down to wrapping this particular webinar up. We can help. CISEMA is able to help certainly in many different areas. Victoria, you just want to summarize some of those areas where you folks can help?
Thanks, Gary. Yeah, so we can help you obviously through pre-registration, registration, and post-registration of your medical device in China. So we can help you look at things such as feasibility of avoiding, for example, a clinical trial within China, and what is the best regulatory pathway for you. Once we've identified that, we are acting as an NMPA legal agent on behalf of our clients. So we can help you with filings of Class 1 or registration of Class 2 and Class 3 products, as well as applying for any of the specialist pathways into China, including the innovative medical device pathway. And then obviously post-registration, it's of vital importance that you keep compliant whilst on the market with all the standards and regulatory changes that happen on a regular basis in China. And obviously we can help you as well with your in-China audits or even overseas factory inspections, as well as helping you adapt any quality management systems. And even if you decide to, at one point, localize your manufacturing in China, we can help move your certificate from an imported certificate to a made in China one. So Gary.
All right, very good. I'll touch on the Reed Tech solution and where we're able to help you do data management. We have a platform, single source for medical devices, that accepts data from your particular repository, and then is able to pull that data together and submit it off to many different health authorities, including China. So there's a working API in place for China. We've submitted many different records already. And just a quick model or discussion on the business model. This particular system that we have is able to make use of global corporate users as well as local users. So if you have local users that are collecting and managing some fields, some of which has to be translated, they can work as part of your team, all with a single platform. And then that data, once it's a full, complete, validated record, is then able to be sent off to the regional health authority. In this case, it would be China. Angela, why don't you wrap us up here? I know there's one poll question that you might want to try to get in as well.
Yeah, it looks like we're at the top of the hour, but thank you for participating today. As always, we will send you follow-up materials to share with your team. You can contact CISEMA. Their email address and website are on the screen. They will also be included in the links. And always Reed Tech, meddevice@reedtech.com if you have UDI questions. Thank you to our panelists from CISEMA, Hamish King and Victoria Caldy. And everyone have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you.